So welcome to today's Teach Educational Rounds webinar. The topic is Nutrition and Tobacco Cessation. Faculty presenter is Barbara Cantwell from Hamilton Family Health Team. Okay, now if you are interested in obtaining a letter of completion for today's session, you must have already completed the registration and pre-learning assessment. If you have not completed this, please do so very soon by visiting our website www.teachproject.ca. The registration will close in about 10 minutes. Another requirement is that you must sign in to view the live webinar using your first and last name. If you signed in to today's webinar using anything other than your first and last name, please email me before the end of the day today. And then following the webinar, we'll send you a link to the evaluation and post-learning assessment. These webinars are being live tweeted. Follow the CAMH Nicotine Dependent Services at PS Quit Smoking. To follow the live tweeting or to post your questions, use hashtag #TeachWebinar. So again, our faculty presenter today is Barbara Cantwell. She is an expert in comprehensive primary health care nutrition and is currently a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator at the Hamilton Family Health Team. She is recognized for her broad knowledge and clinical skills in nutrition and a focus on interdisciplinary care. Barbara has worked as a community dietitian, nutrition support specialist, educator, health leader, and as a researcher. She's an active peer leader in the Hamilton Family Health Team Motivational Interviewing Program and long-term member of Dietitians of Canada Primary Healthcare Action Group. Barbara holds a Master of Health Studies Leadership, bachelor's degree in applied human nutrition and microbiology and immunology. These are disclosures. No disclosures for guest faculty. The TEACH curriculum and slides were developed and compiled with funding from the Government of Ontario, Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. Contents of the slides are based primarily on evidence-based guidelines from the following sources. These materials, as well as the verbal presentation and any discussion, set out only general principles and approaches to assessment and treatment and do not constitute clinical or other advice and do not replace the need for individualized clinical assessment and treatment plans. Now, before I hand it over to our guest presenter today, I'm just going to ask a few polling questions. So the first question is asking, what region are you from? Looks like the majority of you are from GTA, Southwest area, and a large portion from outside of Ontario. That's great. Okay, the next question is asking, what type of organization do you work for? Majority of you are from hospitals and public health units. Great. And the last question is asking what disciplines you belong to. Great. The majority of you are registered nurses and or dietitian nutritionists. Thank you everyone for participating in the poll. Now before I hand it off to our guest presenter today, I just want to ask if you could please try and hold your questions to the end of the webinar, and you can type in your questions into the chat box or ask them on the teleconference line at the end. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see people from so far abroad, and welcome to the presentation. This presentation reflects the experience of working with clients in primary health care setting for whom behavior change is seen to be a significant barrier to improving their health outcomes, be it outcomes for treatment, risk reduction, or prevention. My intention is to survey the literature on the role of nutrition in tobacco cessation and then focus on how strategies are used for dietary change can also enhance success in working with clients looking to stop smoking. The main challenges we face counseling clients about smoking cessation are how to move folks out of complacency about making lifestyle changes, how to allay fears or at least reframe their concerns about weight gain that is associated with quitting, and how to make sense of a profusion of new literature on the mechanisms of addiction and the regulation of food intake. The presentation is set up in 3 parts. Starting at the last point to look at the neurobiology and regulation of food intake and smoking cessation. Then want to look at what is understood about the food-related choices that tobacco users make when they are trying to reduce or eliminate nicotine. And then take a broader look at food literacy to identify client barriers and enablers to making more healthy food choices that support those tobacco cessation efforts. As you can see, I kind of look at these 2 behaviors, smoking and food intake, as being not only complementary, but to a certain degree driving each other. As a dietitian, I am, for the most part, working with clients who, by the time I meet with them, have not responded effectively to nutrition information that they've been given or advice. They've already been exposed to a lot of nutrition information. Their interventions, in their interactions with family, other health professionals, or the nutrition retailers, or well-meaning strangers like the lady in the laundromat. I work with clients to move them along the continuum of awareness to intention to action, and I come at that task with a broad understanding of pathophysiology and biochemistry, as well as foods and nutrition and behavioral change management. Although I've worked in a variety of primary care models, this works best in practices where I'm fortunate to work within reach of mental health counselors, pharmacists, and a physician. And we actually often co-book appointments with our clients. Smoking cessation requires so much of our clients that food messages often get lost among worries and stressors about health outcomes, about their anxiety, about withdrawal, or giving up something that's part of themselves. Weight issues are the most common trigger for the dietitian referral. So if we're not able to address weight fears alone, where are the opportunities to use nutrition interventions to support folks to stop smoking or maintain a tobacco-free lifestyle? How does food change alter one's approach and success in areas that otherwise thwart nutrition cessation, tobacco cessation? So the neurobiology of smoking and food consumption is a complex system of checks and balances, and there's emerging research that provides more clues linking cravings, food cues, cognitive restructuring, and changes seen in brain function in the brain. I'm going to start here knowing that this is not by any means an area in which I hold expertise, but understanding the scope of inquiry and the pace of change in our understanding of neurobiology helps us to better respond to clients' concerns about their symptoms, about the role of medications, or the contribution of willpower versus genetically determined responses in their bodies. It's a powerful tool to letting clients hear each of us on the healthcare team speaking in the same voice and letting them be curious enough to distinguish the specific value in each of their encounters with us. The bulk of this kind of work comes from animal studies that inform our practice. Food intake and tobacco use are connected because the anatomical and physiological links of neuropeptides in addiction and the neuroendocrine cascades are shared. There's large biological variations in the pre- and post-synaptic environments that drive the physiological changes that lead to a person choosing one or the other behavior, to smoke or not to smoke, to have one food or the other. There's three significant systems. These are determined by the major neuropeptides, dopamine and serotonin, and the neuroendocrine system, the hormonal modulation of hunger, satiety, along the gut-brain axis that feeds our craving and alters food intake. Nicotine activates nicotinic receptors in the brain, which excite dopamine neurons, increasing dopamine release and then reinforcing the desire for tobacco use via feelings of pleasure. It's this trigger leads to the behavior, and then the result is that pleasure feeling that we get, which is the same with food. Evidence for dopaminergic system involvement in preference for sweet foods and in sustaining tobacco use include decreased consumption of sweet foods following smoking, or there is relief or dampening of the withdrawal symptoms when sucrose is given to abstaining tobacco users. Ex-tobacco users increase their sweet intake, and one can see an increase in fruit intake comparing tobacco users and non-users. There's also some evidence that vitamin C can interact with the dopaminergic system. The story with the serotonin is not as clear. Serotonin acts to release non-dopamine neuropeptides that drive a multitude of responses initiated by different serotonin sensitive receptors, but at the same neuronal sites. There's a complexity to how the cell messaging selects which number of serotonin receptors are expressed. That is way too complicated for me to try and address in this presentation. Unlike the dopamine, there's really little information available about the specific impact of foods energetic system. So what we see a client as choice is deeply connected to this biological variation in the numbers and the kinds of pre- and post-synaptic environments, and they change the physiological drive. We're looking at significant paradigm shifts as new information becomes available and we start moving away from addiction, smoking, obesity as diseases of choice to diseases that have a very strong physiological drive. So nutritionism is the dominant paradigm within nutrition science. This is the reductionist stance that tries to explain how we understand foods in terms of their nutrient and their biochemical composition. It's one of the major driving forces in the emergence of concepts like superfoods and the junk food phenomena that marks the onset of the obesity and diabetes epidemic worldwide. But at some level, we need to stop talking about nutrients and neuropeptides and start looking more at the way we eat or move or smoke. So it is this move from providing information to people, hoping that they will take that information and act accordingly, to actually looking at what client behaviors can we support and strategies we can give them so that they can eat the foods they love when they're hungry in just the right amounts. We do know a bit about what tobacco users are eating and have some limited evidence to guide us in what tobacco users ought to be eating. It's generally held that the nutrition intervention strategies ought to assist clients move to healthier eating patterns as they progress through their quit program. Smoking cessation results in a transient metabolic changes that lead to weight gain. It increases beta cell secretions and insulin resistance, and in particular fat gain, and as which result from these changes. Essentially, this is what the same kinds of things we see in metabolic syndrome. We need to reframe people's concerns about weight gain away from this sort of mythical healthy weight in order to look at eating in a way that improves the person's health. I think everybody knows that dieting doesn't work, and the evidence is quite strong that it's actually one of the best ways to gain weight. So where weight is concerned, these changes are more evident in heavy tobacco users when they quit. When one reads about the studies that purportedly controlled for diet intake, we can be critical and ask, did these folks actually follow the diet? And Persky's work looked at adherence to both diet and exercise recommendations during a sustained tobacco cessation program. Success to adhering to recommendations was stronger for smoking than it was for diet, and stronger again than exercise, and yet all of those adherence decreased with time. The patterns seem to be similar for both diet and smoking changes, supporting an important role for dietary interventions as a beneficial adjunct to quit programs. Monitoring for altered glucose metabolism seems prudent, especially in those already living with or at risk for diabetes. The molecular biology is now at the point where we know that events at the level of the neurons are important. Nicotine decreases food intake by activation of specific opiomelanocortin neurons. So as our understanding about the shared neuroscience events that shape food cravings and cigarette cravings improves, hopefully we'll be able to reconcile this addiction as disorder of choice versus biological variability. So breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Anybody heard that? The biggest shift is the way that we look at energy use. The biggest shift in the way that we look at energy use in the last 5, maybe 10 years is probably our understanding about the impact of sleep. This shifting from nighttime, low glucose environment to daytime shifts in hormones meant to optimize fuel use in the glucose-dependent organs and the role that fat plays in glucose availability. The evidence is convincing. The strongest predictor of successful weight loss is eating breakfast. A related finding that fruit and vegetable consumption is inversely associated with indicators of nicotine dependence, like measured as cigarettes per day or the time to the first cigarette, gives us clues to interventions. Simply ask clients to break the fast within 2 hours of waking, often results in delaying the first cigarette, altering weight gain, and it seems prudent to recommend that they should include fruit or vegetables at that first meal. But we know smokers don't eat breakfast. Population studies over long periods of time have also been notable in finding that there is a huge increase in the incidence of diabetes with breakfast skipping. So how do we decide what to eat? Food literacy is one of the ways to step back and take a bigger picture look at the nutrition interventions that help clients. Food literacy is the collection of interrelated knowledge, skills, and behaviors required to plan, manage, select, and prepare, as well as eat foods. And this graphic sets out one way to focus on food-related needs, the specific client competencies, the knowledge, the skills missing that must be addressed to favor tobacco cessation. Prioritizing money and time for food is a real key for many people. We often hear, I can't afford food, but thank goodness I'm able to get my cigarettes at the res. Planning meals becomes difficult, and the notion of balance for meals often is not something that people are using. Preparing good tasting food requires a certain ability to taste foods and have a knowledge of preparing common foods. The selection of foods is definitely based on culture. It's based on our socio-economic status and access to foods. And certainly food insecurity is one of the key things that people come to the dietitian struggling with. We understand how food impacts and how we feel, and yet many people, even the sensation of hunger and fullness, have been corrupted because of their lifestyle choices. So the determinants of a food choice likewise can be categorized using this food literacy matrix. Planning tools and approaches can help people manage cravings. They help people learn to manage hunger and identify satiety. And of course, they also help in terms of money management. Preparation builds food savvy and also allows people with comorbidities such as physical disabilities, depression, or pain to be able to eat better. Food selection is pretty hard when taste changes and food is not palatable. And eating, the experience of eating often is altered because of depression or other things that limit enjoying foods. In my experience, smoking, disordered eating, pain, and food insecurity are the top issues patients face rather than food or nutrient knowledge deficits. This kind of sorting foods into a selection of interventions that will help allows them to pick more targeted interventions to work on at any one time. So every day we hear that we live in an obesogenic environment. We're now seeing families where it's 3 generations where that people have not had the experience of growing up in households where they cook at home. This is, Jamie Oliver is one of the ambassadors for this and trying to get cooking into schools to allow kids to learn skills that otherwise people assume that they've gotten from their parents or their grandparents. What the connection between ultra-processed foods and craving and tobacco cessation are have not been clearly articulated in the research. But knowing that these are high in sugar certainly links those behaviors. So that strategies to increase client awareness of the environmental factors that provide the situations in which the cravings occur is key to move people from the shame and blame about their weight or body dissatisfaction to skill building using behavior modification approaches, self-assertiveness, and clearly this is an example of things that can be done by different members of the team. So I know that motivational interviewing has been a focus of other talks in this series, and I want to take a minute to look at how that fits into our practice. Brower et al. Put forth an evidence-based, consensus-driven, integrated model of interdisciplinary nutritional care that offered new research findings that defining the roles of all the members of the primary health care team. This is also the first time that clearly distinguished the scope of team members in providing nutrition advice versus nutrition counseling. At each of the encounters with clients, we ask ourselves, are they here to get information? For instance, a telephone call to their health unit. Are they here to get advice? Eat more, eat less, walk more. Or they're here not to get advice, but instead to work with us to explore and understand better their food choices as it relates to their health status. Exposing and exploring the client's lifetime learned pattern of eating allows the client to reflect and identify what works or not. And that's really our key to getting them motivated, because we want to start with something they already feel is working and get better at that. So at the epicenter of our food talk is really our own personal understanding of smoking, food choice, and cravings, as well as health change management. Well, in the context of today's topic, motivational interviewing is really good at weeding out some of the strongly held health and nutrition misconceptions and helping clients understand the uncertainties about the science and the medicine in order to develop the discrepancies that allow them to make a choice between changing or not changing. Since the first major studies looking at the association between attitudes of food intake, started 20 years ago, the message has not changed. Folks have an idea of what healthy eating looks like, but they don't eat that way. Questionnaires sent to folks looking at attitudes about healthy eating, self-assessment of their adequacy of diet, and approach to food found that when food is not important to people, their appreciation for the food experience is minimized. Think of a time when you ate something when you really weren't sure what it was you were eating, or you realized you weren't sure how much you ate or how it tasted. This food awareness is difficult when other determinants of eating prevail. Folks don't know what they want to change, much less how to go about doing it. Is it the right time to do this? How important is it to do? What skills do they need to do it? Now, in terms of food, you're talking about those determinants. Is it looking at cooking better? Is it looking at eating at different times? Taste, or the sensory aspect of foods, is contextual. How good something tastes really depends on if we're hungry, what else we're eating, who we're eating it with. And yet taste trumps most things when it comes to eating. When it doesn't, then we look and say, is there something sinister happening? Is this a purposeful food restriction? Is there extreme food insecurity, metabolic disorders, end-stage disease? Some of the research that has been done has tried to tease out actually the difference in palatability and taste of foods to smokers. These have been summarized as foods that enhance the taste of tobacco, alcohol, caffeinated drinks, high meat diet, high dairy diet, compared to foods that make that tobacco taste worse: fruit, vegetables, and the non-caffeinated drinks. This gives us clues as to why people are eating the way they're eating, but also at how to manipulate their food choices to discourage smoking. Of course, taste acuity changes, just the complete loss of taste happens as in smoking because of fewer and flatter taste buds, as well as the other chemicals, for instance, in cigarette smoke. I'd like to take a minute and talk about problematic eating. Eating that's not really related to the day-to-day habits in terms of meal spacing or the kinds of foods that people have available, or the planned eating. There's in food cravings do run their course in time and they go away. Mindfulness is used to take a curious stance in exploring the foods that we eat, and lets one determine, am I hungry now? If I'm not hungry, what am I feeling? So managing food cravings there's a lot of resources available to us. The program Craving Change is a Canadian program co-founded by a dietitian and psychologist, and it teaches why
Welcome to Craving to Quit, a 3-week program that will help you quit smoking. This training, delivered live at Yale University, has been shown to be twice as effective as other quit smoking therapies. Now I'll walk you through the basic idea about how habits are formed. First, recognize that the wanting or craving is coming on and relax into it.
The wave, to be curious and to experience what is it like, this craving, and what can I learn about it to help me stop. So there's an app for this. A lot of this work that's been done in craving and smoking comes out of Yale University, and Dr. Judson Brewer, who is a neurobiologist and physician who has done a lot looking at the role of mindfulness and mindful practices on cravings. We're going to take a couple of minutes now to look at a video about an app, phone app that he has developed that has been tested and actually has been shown to be twice as effective as more traditional approaches to smoking cessation. Tanya, do you want to start that video? Thank you. Thanks. I wanted to show that just to bring your attention to some of the newer ways we're looking that are available to us for people trying to stop smoking. Certainly for a large number of the clients that we work with, they don't have smartphones or these kinds of programs seem too expensive for them. But it really brings together some of the other work that is available that doesn't cost a lot to help people with mindfulness and a way of looking at behaviors in terms of both smoking and food cravings and healthier eating in general. So changing our clients' relationship food is the essential step to creating this nutritional, physiological, and social environment that's going to support people to letting go of their tobacco habit. It's about coaching rather than telling or cheerleading. And it puts the client at the center and gives them permission to go stepwise, which means that we need to be which allows us to be non-judgmental and accept the changes no matter how small, that they are picking. We can work on mindfulness, we can work on food choice, or even just breaking the fast. I found that some of the food literacy skills is really where people want to start, and that allows them to make the next step to actually looking at the changes that are going to help with making a healthier diet. In summary, the role of nutrition in tobacco cessation must center on changing the client's relationship with food. Today, we've had a small review of the neurobiology of addiction. We looked at social determinants of food choice and smoking, food skills, and looked at some resources that support managing problematic eating and smoking. We all tend to get good at what we practice, and the Food Talk supports clients in their efforts to quit by identifying successes and building on those. Success takes practice. Change takes practice to be successful, and motivation to change depends on clients figuring out, is this the right time? Is it important enough? And how do I, do I now have the skills to do this? Teamwork, certainly in looking at how the different professions work together to help the people at each one of these steps is speaks for itself. It's one of the important things that we can build on as well. So I'd be pleased to respond to questions at this time. Tanya's going to help me with that.
Great, thank you, Barbara. So if anyone is joining us via the teleconference and you want to ask a question, you can hit *1 on your phone to unmute your line. As well, if you would like to ask a question online, just simply type in the chat box. I see already that there is a question here. How long does it take to regenerate taste buds when quitting?
I don't know exactly whether it's the same in quitting as in other conditions. Essentially, people do talk about not being able to taste food the same way, you know, several weeks after, and other people do come back. We see people monthly saying, wow, I never knew food tasted this good.
Jean, you're asking if all Teach Education Round webinars are recorded. They certainly are recorded. You can just visit our website, www.teachproject, I will write it down, .ca, and on the left-hand side menu, you'll see Teach Educational Rounds on the side menu, and then you'll click Archive and Self-Study.
So Dennis is asking about the relationship of exercise to these programs. I didn't actually explore that in the work that I did for this presentation, but I think that most of the programs we have are really looking at the dyad of nutrition, depression, and smoking, and clearly exercise in terms of the depression piece has been demonstrated to be an enabler for people to get better. So, and that includes both quitting the smoking as well, all three things together.
It looks like the next question is from Susan. I'm curious to hear about success stories that you may have or be aware of from the app usage.
So this app was only launched in January, and so I have not seen it. It's being used out of Yale. There is some information online. You can go to Dr. Judson Brewer or look up the app on YouTube.
Next question is from Karen. What tips do you have regarding encouraging people to start eating breakfast?
So I find people get a little overwhelmed at breakfast, and they think we're asking them to sit down to bacon and eggs or something. In any kind of program to reestablish a meal-wise pattern, the success seems to be to get people to break the fast, to have something at a timed interval. So usually my first step is to get them to use, whether it's the alarm on their telephone, and to give them a time frame, eat within 2 hours of breakfast or eat every 2 hours or every 3 hours. And I'm only asking them to have a bite. They get to choose whatever they want, and that's the minimum requirement, and they practice that. And then you can see when they come back how ambitious they've actually been. Some people come back and they say, I'm eating, toast and cheese every day for breakfast, 9 times out of 10. Other folks, it's hit and miss. I went to brunch on Sunday or whatever. But actually doing it daily with a minimum expectation of what that break the fast looks like has been more successful.
Great. And Malva asks, I've read that high doses of vitamin C will drop blood nicotine levels quickly. Is this true?
I don't know that research. I can't speak to that.
Okay. And Robin, you're asking about sending the PowerPoint slides to your colleagues. So we record and archive all of our webinars. So the recording will look just like the screen here today, and people can download the PDF on the bottom right-hand side. So feel free to direct your colleagues to our website, teachproject.ca, under Teach Educational Rounds, Archive and Self-Study. I've written it further down in the chat, so you can just do that. And then Shelley asks, during your initial intake, when would you discuss the food issue, and when they bring it up?
So people are referred to me as the dietitian, so I'm not actually seeing them initially for smoking cessation. I work in a practice where the STOP program is being administered by our clinical pharmacist, and I know there's a lot of locations that don't have a clinical pharmacist on the clinical team, and it is really either through specifically people coming to her for smoking cessation and it's identified that food is an issue that we would work together, or generally people who are being referred to me as a dietitian for another reason where smoking is identified as a barrier to healthy eating. And in that case, motivational interviewing takes a big place to ask people, are they considering stopping smoking? And if not, we park that and look at the food and then are able, when they're ready, to bring the connection.
Okay, great. And Jennifer Bradley asks, my clients tend to respond well to framing smoking cessation as the breaking of an important relationship. Do you think that this approach can work well with food changes?
So it's a little different, isn't it? Because we can't really do without food. I think that the key there is that the relationship is the notion of food is comfort, because often it's still that trigger behavior, the dopamine and the reward center biology that's happening, and it's this habit that we've learned that by eating food I can trigger that comfort sensation, and finding alternatives other than food that still reward or provide comfort to people in their lives. So one of the strategies, for instance, in the Craving Change program is to ask people to do an emotions log and connect it with food and see how many times are they eating related to boredom, frustration, fatigue, anger, and then they can work through those. And that's why the Craving Change program also often looks at keeping people in connection with counselors who can help them on the non-food related issues that are the triggers for problematic eating. We want people to enjoy foods. Eat the foods you love when you're hungry in just the right amounts. And so that's why the identifying hunger cues and eating that's not related to hunger, that's the relationship that needs to change, I think.
Audrey asks if there is evidence of mucosal lining or GI function with tobacco use, or is the link mainly just to things happening in the brain?
So actually, it's a really good question, but I was not able to find sort of a clear pathway to that, because a lot of the research are these animal studies, or it doesn't distinguish whether they were looking at nicotine reduction or stopping smoking. So for instance, a lot of the studies that include using the nicotine patch, so they're not smoking anymore, but they're following that trail. So so the understanding is that the brain dopamine pathway is really mediated through nicotine, but clearly if someone is smoking, they're inhaling other components that are going to their gut, and we know that smokers do have a higher incidence of reflux and gastritis. So it's probably, there we go, there's an assumption. It's mediated most likely by different components related to tobacco smoking in particular.
And Robin has asked, many clients have economic barriers. Even though they can rationalize purchasing cigarettes, healthy food choices can be expensive. Are there any online resources we can direct clients to which will give them some ideas and recommendations? So I see that Kathy Ann has made a recommendation about Good Food Box. Do you have anything else to any other resources to add, Barbara?
So the Good Food Box is really available just in Southern Ontario, which is a community purchasing program where folks go directly to a food wholesaler and therefore can provide a monthly shopping basket to people of produce at about half the cost that they would if they went to the grocery store. So each local community may have things like that. We're really talking about the value and how people distribute their income to different things, whether it's housing because they have this huge mortgage, or cigarette smoking because they like it, at the expense of food. And food is always easiest to switch because there's so many food outlets around. I think part of it is really looking at when we look at that food literacy model, the planning component, which allows people to then look at how do I make simple meals. So we, for instance, often we have free cookbooks, a sort of a cooking on a budget recipe book that uses a limited number of ingredients but has recipes that only use those, and teach people or work with people to consider, stocking a pantry of stuff that's available either through the food bank or goes on sale at No Frills Groceries, and then how to learn foods, to be more savvy about using those ingredients. One strategy that I use is just to ask people to consider what's a meal, what would make a meal, and then they can look at that it has to be different kinds of foods, that it probably shouldn't be all sweets or shouldn't be all fried foods, and they work through building food skills. It's a much slower process, but it will help them deal with whatever their limitations are. It's completely different if you're dealing with people that don't have a stove and a fridge in their room where they live. Hard question.
And what about drinking water? Is that indicated as a factor in smoking cessation?
For sure, and I think one of the hard things in our current situation is that people are spending money on bottled water, and or they don't have the community water isn't felt to be safe. You know, we're lucky to live in a community where even though people use lots of bottled water, the water is actually not too bad. So that, it's water or fluids, but yes, it's great because it also addresses some of the hand-to-mouth issues of smoking, which is a habit that takes longer to break.
And Terry asks if increased caffeine has an impact on nicotine replacement therapy.
So I'm not prescribing therapy that's managed by our pharmacists, but my understanding from our protocol is that although we discourage excess caffeine intake, we would not limit or modify the nicotine prescription, that is really based on what their current intake from, say, cigarettes would be, and the sort of new guy on in the picture is people getting nicotine from these e-cigarettes, which a lot of people don't consider that that's related. They say, oh, I quit smoking, I'm only on EVAP. But I think the caffeine is more related to the fact that caffeine changes or enhances the taste of the cigarettes, and it's a linked behavior, and it makes it very hard for people then to ride that wave of the craving if they're craving both caffeine and nicotine at the same time.
If anyone from STOP or anyone else from TEACH has joined us, if you can also comment to this in the chat box. I know with the sublingual nicotine replacement therapy, so the gum, the lozenge, the inhaler, I know caffeine does affect the absorption of that. In fact, anything acidic, 15 minutes before or 15 minutes after taking the sublingual nicotine replacement therapy does affect your absorption. So I don't have too many more details about that, but if someone else from STOP can comment or TEACH on other recommendations that you know of, other than that. And the next question from Daryl is, are you incorporating the information about food choices and taste of tobacco into individual counseling or focusing on healthy food choices?
I have really gone to a motivational interviewing kind of format and do the information that I give to people is always triggered by their questions. So if people are asking me what's healthier, we'll address that. And more, I'm looking at the experience of eating and taste with them and making them aware of the fact that the reason they're not hungry is probably related to the appetite suppressant effects of the tobacco, and working on the strategies to get them to eat more. And typically, as I mentioned before, in a timed manner, and trying to actually get the behavior of having something to eat before that enjoyment that comes from the food, and then using journaling and self-reflection on their experiences of eating and if it's improving.
And Shauna asks if there are any particular supplements recommended, such as pro or prebiotics.
I have not seen any literature that associates gut microbiota with smoking interventions, and I would just use a general nutritional assessment to decide whether or not a person would benefit from supplements or if they could afford them.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Karen asks, what are your thoughts on using artificial sweeteners for sweet cravings? Do they help or hinder?
There is some limited information on the effects of I think it's primarily aspartame, but there may be more information, more on the impact on appetite suppression, so through the neuroendocrine pathways that suggest that part of the lack of weight loss in people who are having large amounts of sugar substitutes is related to that reward system that is sort of mimicked with the sugar substitutes. I don't think the information is adequate enough to answer that with any kind of certainty. Typically, my approach is actually to ask if the craving is related to hunger or not. And if it isn't, we're not encouraging non-nutritive eating. And it's identifying what are you craving. If you're not craving food, what else will help you in that particular situation. That relationship with food, and this may be where things like exercise would come in. Go out and walk to the end of the block and come back and see if you're still hungry.